thank you, Carlin. I think everyone that you were also a great influence on me and contributed, as were a number of people that I see have signed on, which is fabulous. I should say this opening still is a shot from a Super 8 film I did called The Sword Swallowers, and it's from a brochure of experimental film that was curated by Midi Onodera and Richard Fung. And I'm using it because it's one of the few pictures I have of my fabulous body from the 1980s, which I wouldn't do now. Anyways, I just want to do a couple of qualifiers before I launch forth. First, I've never done one of these, so forgive me if I stumble around. Secondly, I've always drawn, but my art practice has been multidisciplinary. So apart from painting and drawing, I've often done, I think, collective or collaborative work, whether it was co-founding the feminist journal Fireweed, making documentary films with the film board with a fabulous team and crew, or writing lyrics with a band like the Parachute Cub. So I actually didn't set out to do these things. They kind of emerged from being part of a zeitgeist or part of an environment that I was in. So I kind of thought I would take a look at some of the contexts and the environments, and just to kind of mark, to contextualize or mark some of the things that I ended up doing. I wanted to say that I think when I was thinking about this very quickly, that I really have had two separate selves. One was my pre-feminist self, pretty much from my childhood until I was in Toronto and around 26 or 27. And then the post-feminist. So I've kind of structured a little bit around that. I also saw that, I listened to a few and saw that a number of artists talked a little bit about their background or their childhood, which influenced their practice and who they were and how they interacted with environments. And I don't think I've ever really done that. So I've sort of got my nerve together and done it. So here goes. This may be a little long. I haven't had time to really time it, so I might just skip things, but here we go. I grew up in a broken home with my mom and two brothers in Kelowna, which was a very small town in the 50s. We were very poor and we're definitely on the wrong side of the tracks. And this is a picture of me in 1955 with a dog, Susie, which I think I put a t-shirt on. But you can see the landscaping leaves a lot to be desired. I felt like the odd sock in my family because I love to read. And I actually read through the entire collection of books, kids' books at the public library by the time I was 10. Apparently I would come home with stacks of books on astronomy, on famous artists, and tons of novels. So I lived really in the world of stories. And on the one hand, I lived for those stories. When a novel was finished, I felt I was being like excommunicated from that wonderful family. And in our broken home with a seriously ill mother, an absent alcoholic father, and the humiliations of being on welfare. One of the things that I just mentioning, not to do sob stories, but I think it has been signaled in how I've approached the world or not, was that the librarian at the public library took away my library card because she felt I was reading too much and I was trying to take books out from the adult shelves. And I have to say, I don't think there was anything more of a rupture or more devastating to me in terms of a lesson about power and who the gatekeepers were and what they could do. But luckily, when I was 12, my uncle, my fabulous uncle, brought us to Vancouver to live with him in a house he'd bought on West 12th. So we kind of went to a middle class area. And it was an area where the kids weren't expected to go to the slammer or juvenile delinquents place, but to university. So in retrospect, it was wonderful, but it was a kind of a shock. So I felt like I had to put on a disguise, and I kind of, in case I got found out by the other kids or the librarians of the world, I became very, very restrained, and I did what General Idea once talked about, is I basically went through the motions with a facade and restrained myself very strictly. But as soon as so in Vancouver, here I am at 18. As soon as I graduated high school, I went to work at UBC Library and became, I monitored classes, I read voraciously. It was sort of the ending of Bohemia, which was fading, and the early hippie culture was coming up. And pot and acid were serious conscious-raising drugs. They weren't like party drugs, kind of like ayahuasca is today. I read voraciously, wrote terrible poetry, which I'll never forgive my mother for keeping some of, and dreamed of being, I think, an artist or a folk singer, which is pretty funny because I can't sing. Anyways, 2 years later, just as I was about to drop acid for the first time, I somehow knew I probably shouldn't do that. I picked up a bag of whatever money I had and a little hitchhiking bag and hitchhiked across the country to Montreal and ended up at Expo 67, where I worked for 3 years in a brokerage in the financial industries of all places, and had a painter boyfriend who I basically supported. When we were vegetarians, we were studying a yoga called Agni Yoga, which is loosely associated with Theosophy, if anyone knows of that. And I wasn't really doing any art at all. I was sort of working for, I didn't believe a woman could be a real artist. I wasn't a feminist. I wasn't a political person. But when the company I worked for wanted to open a Toronto office in '71, I jumped at it, and me and my boyfriend moved here. So, and that's where I began to draw again. Although my boyfriend was the real artist, in quotes, I fell in love with art by surrealists like Leonora Carrington, Lynne Fernie, and turn of the century people like Aubrey Beardsley. And I began to do these very sort of surrealist ink drawings with a million tiny dots. And I found the world's worst brownie photo of one of them. So I doubt whether any of my old pals have seen this, but it's kind of a psychoanalytic dream. So they're very big, but every part of that shading is 1 zillion tiny dots. And I love the sensuality of it, the skin of it. In around 74, 75, my boyfriend and I break up. So I hung out with some party friends, and someone gave me a copy of Germaine Greer's The Female Eunuch. It's like I'm already like 27 by this time. And the women's movement has been, you know, in a power for a number of years already. So anyways, it sat on my shelf for quite a few months, and I would kind of give it the side eye because, you know, the cover of it is kind of freaky. And for some reason, one evening, I sat down to read it, and by morning, I was a different person. It's as if my whole worldview shifted a notch, and I became incandescent with rage. I was beside myself, literally. I think I even had a temperature. And I realized I was either going to do something very violent, or I had to start to do something positive and constructive with that anger. And I met a poet by the name of Charlene Sheard, and I joined the Women's Writing Collective. And through the Women's Writing Collective, I met an extraordinary group of women writers and feminists. These were the 4 I was the closest to. And it's, in case anyone doesn't remember, at the front with the beret is Betsy Warland, a poet and writer, Charlene Sheard, a poet who tragically died very early, and Gay Allison. Gay Allison, a poet, Gay Allison, she was very instrumental in my life. She was one of the handful of wonderful women who inspired everyone to do everything. Or somehow, even when you didn't want to do it, she would sort of say, why not? Let's do it. Let's do it. And you'd end up engaged in something. And that's how we kind of co-founded the Fireweed, a women's journal, although Betsy wasn't in it. And these are 4 issues. This was 1978. We had never done a book. I don't know what we were thinking, because it was such a lot of work, and we had no money, and no one had any money. But we sold some advanced subscriptions. We put a call out for some poems and essays and so forth, and it got launched. Somehow we got it. These covers are, the first one up on my left anyways is the first issue, and we used a drawing on my cover of mine because I don't think we had any other visuals yet at the time. And then these are just 4 other covers. The one up on top, the sort of blurry one on the right, was completely dedicated to Judy Chicago's dinner party, which showed at the AGO, and Carlin is in that book, so I was glad to find that cover. A woman named Rena Fraticelli joined the Fireweed Collective while it was in production on the last, on the first issue. And as anybody knows, or who knows Rena, that wherever Rena is, there will be a festival. So when we launched that first issue, we launched it.
Yeah. Lynn, I just want to. Can you hear me? I think Rena is on this call, actually. Rena has just joined us.
Oh, fabulous. Hi, Rena. It's all right. I'm saying nice things about you. So Rena and Lorraine Sagata, who I met, and a few other people made a festival, and we launched the first issue of Fireweed with the 3-day Women's Poetry and Music and Reading Festival at Harbourfront in 1978. And I can't name everyone that contributed to all of these because there were just so many. But for the first year and a half or 2, the office was in my apartment on Spadina, and where we met, because I had a very big first room. We all worked for free. In fact, I think, and Rena, you can tell me later if this is right, but I think we all had to personally buy 10 copies of each issue the first couple of, at full bookstore rate, the first couple of years to pay the printer bill. And at the same time I was doing Fireweed, or we were all putting it together, I had a job as a security monitor with the school board, and it was a night shift. And so I did all these pencil drawings because I could listen. They were long shifts. I could listen and do them. And they were stones. There were, I must have done about 30 of them, and I did a show. They're all done with HB Statler type mechanical pencils of different HB scale, and that's what makes the difference between the shadows and the dark and the light. It's just the quality of the scale of the lead. They gradually became more abstract and less representational. So that was, I wasn't really doing anything gestural, which I now do. And they showed at a gallery on Markham. And this was probably 78, this was done in 78, 79. So in 1980, Lorraine and I moved to a 2-floor apartment above a store on Queen Street West, right across from the Queen Mum Cafe. We had 2 floors for $260 a month. So if nothing else brings up the differences between today and then, that rent will. It was incredibly funky. My cat fell through a hole in the floor that we didn't see and landed on the Xerox on the store underneath us. But we had tons and tons of space. I had a studio, Lorraine had an office. We put up a lot of the feminists and guests that were coming to town to do performance art or festivals. And it was right at the corner of Queen and Duncan, which was kind of one of the central areas of absolutely everything that was happening. Lorraine began singing with Mama Kia 2 and V and other groups. And in '82, she and Billy Bryans co-founded the Parachute Club. So you couldn't really be on Queen and not meet musicians, artists, critics, writers, rebels, gay and straight and undecided and not practicing even. There were so many things on Queen Street that I'm not going to touch on because this is sort of a personal artist's foray. But the Cameron, artist-run galleries, cabarets, booze cans, music venues, Page's bookstore was central. That proliferated, and I think it came together: gay rights, feminism, conceptual arts, and political arts to shake up Toronto's Upper Canada button-down culture. At Lorraine in 2015 did an exhibition of her experience of Queen Street Rest between these years, and this is a title card from it that I took, that I shot with my iPad, so it's not her fault that I'm in all the, that I sort of reflect from all the pictures. I think this was a collage that she had in her Myceum exhibition, and it's one of just a few of the artist activities that I think were really incredible. There were choice benefits with Lillian Allen, Clichettes, Sheila Gostick, Hummers, Parachute Club. There was Lillian Allen reading her dub poetry. There was many Clichettes performance art, and there was a program I'll talk about later called Disarm Rapists. Those are my fingerprints. We got caught. And so there was just a plethora of women's and feminist culture going on that integrated, or began at least to try and integrate diversity and politics into the art world. And this is the cover of Now magazine when the Women's Culture Building was founded just a year before this. A number of women got together and in 1981, and they brought together artists, critics, intellectuals, activists from a whole different range of disciplines and arts. And this is when we opened a gallery and actually rented a gallery for a few months to host exhibitions and events. And I believe it's also the first time of the first FemCab, which Carlin thinks was at the Horseshoe and Rena thinks may have been at the theater. But at any rate, we had the first 5-minute feminist cabaret, which went on for years and years and years. It opened the first 5-minute feminist cabaret. I remember the one at the Horseshoe Tavern was packed. And it really changed the dynamics on the street in 1982. I mean, they were people from every community at 5-minute feminist cabaret. There were people from the queer and lesbian community. There were artists who hadn't really identified as feminist or political. There were straight artists. There was just like everybody there, male and female, and it changed how I think feminism was seen in the art world. A lot of people who would never have said they were feminists because they were afraid they were going to be put in a niche, after that sort of proudly claimed it. So I think these events, what they really did was they dismantled a certain level of fear, and of challenge that all the events were making to the patriarchy. There were some other notable events that the Women's Culture Building did. One was a panel discussion called My Favorite Title Ever, Fuck Yous, We're Going to Bingo. It was a sort of sassy talk at the Rivoli as part of Talking a Habit that challenged the lack of women's work in art and theater in town. Disarm Rapists, which I pointed to on that collage, was a spray paint campaign all over town to protest the language used to describe some high-profile rape cases. And unfortunately, myself and a woman named Paula Cornwall were nabbed by the police, and it was a criminal offense, but we got off, you'll be glad to know. The stencil was 5 feet long, so I don't know how we were supposed to spray paint it and run, because it took about 5 minutes to do one letter. Anyways, it was actually a very successful campaign. And there was the panel discussion of Judy Chicago's dinner party that was printed in Fireweed in issue 15. So all of this was just like a hotbed going on with all of the other Queen Street West stuff, like the Chroma Living and galleries and music. But in 1993, the Women's Culture Building did a huge festival. It was a multi-event festival, multi-venue. And I think it with a festival that Partisan Gallery did on women's work really did change the acceptance and the making of women's art and what got into galleries profoundly. Besides the feminist work and the art events, the Body Politic, the gay newspaper, was just around the corner, and so everybody knew everybody. It was in the same neighborhood. When it was raided in the 70s and charged with publishing obscene materials, artists really stood up and did performance benefits to help with the fundraising. And I think most of you know, because I saw, at least when I saw who was coming in, some of the context of that time. But in the late 70s and 80s, the government and the police, the Ontario government and the police wanted to shut down gay visibility and politics. And they also attempted to extend their control of artists' speech and materials by using the power of the Ontario Censor Board. They tried to force video artists and experimental film artists to submit their films for prior censorship. Artists and activists fought back and created a number of events, including 6 Days of Resistance, which was a province-wide series of screenings on the same 6 days in so many cities across the province of films that were not submitted to the censor board. But it was quite frightening because showing work at A-Space or any of the other galleries who participated, you felt you could be raided. So there was an element in this protest of fear. But there was enough of a community and energy that it was fun and sort of kick-ass to take that fear on. And I don't think any of us could have done it alone. So we had to be part of a kind of a radical and political series of communities. This is me in the studio on Queen Street West, and around 1982, I guess, I joined A-Space Gallery. I think Lisa Steele and Clive Robertson talked me into it. And I had drawings in a number of group shows at places like in the Alter Eros Festival at Gallery 76, Sparks Gallery, YYZ, and SAW, Powerhouse in Montreal. And also in the studio at that very typewriter, I wrote the lyrics for the Parachute Club when they were surprised with a deal to do an album. They had no idea they would actually get the album. They thought they might do an EP. So, and by the way, I'm just going to carry on. But this actually, when I left in 1989, this 2-floor apartment became Paul Petro's gallery. These are, I thought you should see, these are, I did hundreds and hundreds of drawings here. All of them gestural, like this, all of them on cheap 18 by 24 inch bond paper pads. I didn't think of them as gallery works. They were just a kind of practice and a pleasure and a kind of a journal. So whatever was going through my mind at the moment, they spontaneously began to, I just spontaneously drew them. And, you know, whatever it would be, I was sort of obsessed with the patriarchal power of the cardinal. So I decided, I decided that all the religious men should have their genitals shown. But they all were in my basement for years, and they're very wrinkly paper because they're so cheap. You can see I left these ones. Those other ones look okay because I put them into Photoshop and kind of fooled around with them, but they actually all look more like the hanging men here, which are very ripply. And I also did some very, very large drawings in that studio, lots of large drawings, some of which I showed and others not. But I think just a year later when Rise Up became the first single for the Parachute Club and became a hit, like I was really floored. And I wrote on quite a few songs with the band, or Troubleshot, or Lorraine would come over and look at lyrics I had and take them and creatively put them together, because I would sometimes tend to write kind of narrative, and that not necessarily what was working. But they were pretty political songs that we were writing on that first album. And this would be drawings that I did for the band. I can't sing. I sound like a dying frog, but I was happy to do the drawings to contribute. So we actually won a gold record, and they let me pose with them. Lorraine and Julie are into headbands, clearly. And Laurie Conger isn't here, but this was also another thing I was doing. So they were very collaborative. At that time, around that time, performance artist Tanya Mars in 84, 85 brought me on board with the arts magazine Parallelogram, which she was the editor of and the typesetter of. First, she brought me as a typesetter because I was a really fast typist, as she was. And then gradually as an associate editor and then a co-editor with her. So like working at typesetting, art catalogs, and became my day job. And that was a wonderful thing. Here are some covers that Clive Robertson kindly sent me this morning, because I don't have any of them at my loft, and I'm in self-isolation. And these were three of them. In the middle, for those of you who don't know, is a photo of Tanya Mars' fabulous performance called Pure Virtue on power and women and Queen Elizabeth, which I would love to see again, Tanya. So those were some of the covers that we did. It was a big magazine. It was in English and French. It had essays, which were translated into both languages, and submissions from all the artist-run centers across Canada on what they were showing in their galleries, and it came out quarterly. And the next project I did, which wasn't drawing, was for Public Access, who commissioned a series of text called Some Uncertain Signs, and they commissioned 22 artists, some very famous like Jenny Holzer, to do text works on the huge Electromedia pixel board at Young and Wellesley. And I was invited to do one. I'm never quite sure how that happened, but it was, they wanted to probe the relation between aesthetics and politics, between theory and practice, art in everyday life, and access and representation in public space. So they were engaging with this. My text was to be Lesbians Fly Air Canada. I wanted to confront the corporate space as it presented itself in advertising, and what and who was absent in corporate advertising. And it turned out that it was the only text to be censored by Electromedia. They didn't mind the word lesbians, but they didn't want it put together with Air Canada. Air Canada wasn't their client, but they wanted to be a good corporate ally and citizen. And so the censorship itself exposed a realm of alliance, which we know very well, but it exposed it nonetheless in the project of how things are censored or kept out of the public realm. We worked out a compromise where I do a pictogram of air and a map of Canada and still run the text. Because if I hadn't come to that compromise, all of the rest of the artists that were going to be following, they were going to close the project. So I'll just show you these. It starts out like that with the artist project. Then that, and it is huge. I don't know if you remember. Fly, air, pictogram. I don't know if anyone understood it. Canada, and it followed up with this text. And even though it lost a lot of the corporate confrontation that I wanted to do with the text, it still was quite extraordinary to see the word lesbians on that huge pixel board when you're walking by there at night. It was a shock, people told me, for those that didn't know about it. And in '86, the debates around pornography and censorship were just raging. They were profoundly passionate and even acrimonious. And for artists who were very anti-censorship, but nonetheless recognized that most sexuality or pornography was in fact a patriarchal one bound by power. We thought, well, how would we develop a woman's erotic language, a language where women could find pleasure and not danger? And some women from A-Space curated a project called Developing a Woman's Erotic Language at A-Space. And that's what this still came from, that Minnie and Richard used on the brochure, on their program brochure. It wasn't, 5 of us were given $300 and access to a Super 8 camera. We were all non-filmmakers. So the idea was that by being ignorant of film, we might break the conventions that kind of caged sexual or erotic imagery in film. It was a nice thought, but it didn't really happen, of course. And when we showed them in a workshop to an all-women audience, what we realized that no film, even if you wanted to be outrageous, was going to do that. The project was going to do it. The fact that women would speak and make films and take power in both the representational or cinematic world and on the political world in our lives was what could break the conventions of who owned such speech. So I think that's still clearly an ongoing battle. It was kind of frightening, though. There were some lesbian artists of the 5 women, and some realized that if the censor board, who was threatening to enter galleries at that time, raided us, friends who were in our films could end up in the archives at Queen's Park with the Attorney General or the policing powers. So some people, when they were making their films, were very nervous, and others wouldn't, had friends who, we didn't have actors, others had friends who wouldn't be in their films. So many of us put ourselves in the films. So we had to confront like a real level of fear that I don't think we were quite as aware of until we were doing this project. And it was a really, really interesting project. Lorraine and Donna Mobbs helped me do that, this little film. I mean, I wouldn't show it outside of a workshop context because it's really not a finished film at all. But out of that fear, having confronted that fear with Super 8, we had questions of visible representation in galleries and publications. Like there were a ton of lesbian and gay and queer and trans people in Queen Street as artists and in the arts, and yet there was very little visible work. There was some, certainly, Colin Campbell's videos, but it really wasn't a presence in the artist-run spaces. There were some small spaces run by artists, but they were quite marginal, and very few of the art world people came to them. So I sort of came up with the idea of putting together a show of artists who would take on this absence, and did site specific in 1987 at A Space. There are 7 artists in the show, and 14 people contributed to the catalog. And at least five or maybe 6 of the people as part of the whole project were women of color, which was really important to me. And it was, and those women had to be doubly brave because they were already marginal with a very minimal presence on Queen Street or in Toronto's arts and culture. They have been working as collectives. So Makeda Silvera, Dion Brand, paintings by Grace Channer and Stephanie Martin and Didi Kaya. That itself, as well as trying to situate a positive or lesbian representation, was really quite an unusual thing. It had happened, but it was an unusual thing in the artist-run centers. Many people I knew through Fireweed and through poetry, like Dion or Makeda. So it was a level of trust that allowed us to work together. This is kind of the text of the foreword of what the point of it was, and it wasn't a manifesto. It was a question. This is an installation shot with Grace Channer's big triptych on the left and Nina Levitt's photograms. I'm so sorry, these are bad. I had to shoot them from the catalog. Jude Johnson's photograms and Grace's painting. At the end there is a video that was commissioned for the show by Margaret Moores. 2 paintings by Stephanie Martin about for colored women, and my own project, which was 2 slide projections on 2 large 4-by-8-foot drawings called The Spectacular Body. That's a detail of it. I took a film strip from The Sword Swallowers, the Super 8 film I did, and the other was a slide of an eclipse. And the notion I was playing with was that as the lesbian body was prevalent mostly in pornography for male pleasure, the lives or the notions or the ideas of a real life of women, of lesbians, were rendered into spectacle. They were absent. And the slide projectors were there as part of playing with the notions of projection. What else did I want to say about that? I just wanted to say the text was like the star of a porn film. The lesbian body is caught within a representational language which consumes her as fantasy at the same time as it ensures her absence. Anyways, I was moving into notions of installation, perhaps with my work, when I was invited by the film board. Rena Fraticelli had become head of Studio D, but I was invited by a director at Studio D to research a documentary on lesbian history all around the world, from the Amazons to the present, and it was a 6-month contract. So it was a pretty tall order, but it was like a fabulous gig. And it was just an extraordinary breadth of research. And Carlin came in, it was too much for one person. Carlin came in and did some wonderful work on it. Dion Brand unearthed traces of a women's calypso bands in historical Jamaica, and there was just so much more. And that film eventually became a film called Stolen Moments, directed by Margaret Westcott. But the next year, Erilyn and I were invited to propose a specifically Canadian documentary. And 4 years later, Forbidden Love premiered at TIFF. And it went on to festivals around the world, and it scooped a pile of awards. And all of those issues I was sort of mentioning, and many I haven't, that were being so hotly discussed in the feminist and art and queer culture worlds, we put into this, were foundational in making this film. It was a hybrid doc that incorporates 4 noirish fiction films based on pulp novels, and the rest was classic documentary interviews with the 10 women who lived a life in a pre-lesbian or gay rights era. It was an amazing thing to do. It took 4 years. And you can see it, and you can stream it for a couple $2 if you've not seen the film from the Film Board. It's not expensive. You can, it's $2 to watch it on their site. Erilyn and I and Rena independently produced this film. Went on to do a film on Jane Rule, Fiction and Other Truths, which also launched TVO's documentary series, and also managed to scoop the Genie that year. But this is 1984, 85, and I realized personally as an artist that for 7 years or longer, I've been logging 12 and 14-hour days. Because not only working on the films, I'd work on the films for 4 months and then do an issue of parallelogram for 4 months. I had ceased to do any visual art, and filmmaking had become my practice. And parallelogram was a demanding job. It was not only making the magazine, but as editors, we were also part of the whole discussion around the AMPAC-RACA's organization of artist-run centers and how the issues were being raised and solved. And by this time, Tanya had left Parallelogram to do her practice and teach. And I had brought on Monica Gagnon, who was co-editing with me. This is the last issue I did of Parallelogram in 1984. So just at the same time, the Jane Rule film was in post-production. I was profoundly committed to a 2-year initiative by the Minkwon Panchayat, aka translates as a Rainbow Council, a group of First Nations and artists of color who volunteered to fast-track anti-racism and inclusion in artist-run centers across the country. It was incredibly exciting, and they agreed to do, for free, a 2-year plan of work starting in 1992 with a very small budget that the association dedicated to it. The next year in Calgary, there was an amazing successful of art and performance by artists of color. But during the conference, miscommunication, mistrust, and new demands put on the council by many artist center reps who hadn't been at last year's agreement, basically put an end to the initiative. The Minkwon Panchayat could not agree to the spirit nor the letter of some of the demands that were being asked. So they left the initiative. It was absolutely devastating. It was devastating for everyone on the Minkwon Panchayat. It was devastating for those of us who had our hearts and souls into the cultural transformation. And I had another issue of Parallelogram to do, and I resigned in solidarity in 1994 with the council. And the last issue I did took on the whole experience of what happened in Calgary and anti-racism and inclusion in the arts. So it was very traumatic for a number of us, but I think it made a tremendous rupture for me with the artist-run center movement, which I've been so involved in. I went into a depression. I really lost about 4 years of my life. So it wasn't until I did nothing really. I don't know, I did some gig work, finished some spin-offs, but I had lost heart. My creative life was was gone. I was burnt out, seriously burnt out. So it wasn't until 98 or 99, I went into the basement and found of our house and found all these drawings that I had done in the 80s. Most were mildewed, I had to throw them out, but some were just dampish. So this was another. These are all like 4 by 5 feet drawings that were done in that studio on Queen Street West. I kind of got excited. I thought, you know, it's not that they're great drawings, but there was energy there, and I remember how much I loved it. And my friend Fernanda Faria, who is the framer at a cow and a great lover and collector of art, kind of inspired me to do more work. So I began to draw again, just on my kitchen floor. And a couple of years later, started having work in little shows. This one was called The Wonders of Animal Instincts, and did this with Wendy Coburn, a sculpture, which is small sculptures on the plinths there. And I had, I don't know, 8 or 9 drawings, and it was at Chrome, a small gallery. But we loved it. It was a nice, small, coherent show. And the first time I'd really showed anything. But by that time, 2001, I really desperately needed work. That's a close-up of the installation shot. And I got approached by Hot Docs to program with them, which was really great. It was a 4 to 5 month gig, and it was the beginning of a 16-year relationship with them. And I also began to do a documentary for kids on homophobia that was a hybrid animation for the Children's Studio with the Film Board. And also Brenda Longfield talked me into teaching her course at York, film production to theory students, which I just loved. I fell in love with all of my students. Anyways, I'm sort of getting to the end here, people. Fernanda told me about a gallery in Prince Edward County that I should approach to show my work. She didn't say a name, and I didn't follow up. Then somehow I heard that it was Carlin Moulton, and I just thought, oh my God, it's Carlin, my dear friend. We'd lost touch for years from the Women's Culture Building days. So we sort of got together, and she said that she'd like to show some work at EUNUCH, and that's when it was in her and Barbara's fabulous house on Orchard Street. And that happened in 2006, and that was the invitation for it. It was, I don't know, these were drawings just a few of the drawings that once again go back to those gestures that I was doing in the 1980s as journal. So the drawing themes sort of re-emerged, and I felt like some of the line was very similar. It was like there was a coherence somewhere there. And this one, it was called Alice Gesticulating, and although I worked mostly in black and white, for some odd reason, I veered off into feeling that this one should have a pastel palette. I've never done anything like that quite since or before. And I got tired of doing stuff on my kitchen floor. So Tamira Sawatsky, one of the artists in Public Studio, who's an architect, we rebuilt my garage. And for the first time since '89, I had a studio. It wasn't big, but it was separate from my living space. And I truly loved it. This is a kind of shot, an installation shot. I could make a mess. And this is looking south, and that's my house that I bought with Colin Campbell back in the 90s at the back. So it was literally 25 feet away, and I could come in and do work. And I did all the work for the next show at Oeno, which was Defying Gravity. So I'm just quickly showing you some of this work. They're all pretty much ink and latex on paper, and they're all mostly 44 by 30. So they're quite large works. This one was called Aphrodite, which is the half male, half female child of Hermes and Aphrodite. I guess I was referring to that, and the notion of of transgender and 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 diverse sexualities. This is just a level of almost marking, almost language gesture that came out. This was called Kundalini, which is also just like the pure pleasure of drawing. This was the last piece I did for the show, and it sort of started to move me into painting, which was an inverted man, and it was actually the first piece that sold. And this was Pyrolean Red, which Carlin and Barbara, I think, own. And the red, you can't see it, is a very, very thick impasto, almost red. So I felt I had pushed paper about as far as it could go. I started really loading it on with a lot more paint. So before I just look quickly at some of the paintings I've been doing in the past year and a bit, I just sort of thought I did do a few more paperworks. I drew this girl. She came like a whole series of girls, popped out of nowhere last year. I just wanted to draw. I did this kind of work, which are 12 inches by 48 inches, gestural drawings adding color. They look, they're designer, but they have a lot of energy. I don't think they're designer, really. I don't know why I said that. But they have just a celebration of rhythm and gender. This one is quite dark. I've called it Night Forest. And I sold my house in 2016 because I needed to leave Hot Docs. I'd been there 16 years and I wanted to paint, which I couldn't paint in the same way I could draw. It requires more. So I rented a loft on Sumac, and that's where I live now, just as a rental, and half of that loft I'm using as my studio. That's a recent painting from last year, where I've really started to erase things, paint things, have almost textual gestural marks that look almost like an alphabet or a hieroglyph start to emerge. This is a Celtic shaman, bear shaman. A painting that I'm still working on that's hanging on the wall because I know I need to do more with it, but which is called Exile. And I did it, I guess, a year and a half ago, 2 years ago even, but it feels so contemporary today with what's happening politically, with so many people being not simply new people, masses of people being exiled away. This one is called Seeing Through Red. It's at Carlin's Gallery. This is as well, Avalon. They're all 4 by 3 feet. And to me, it's a lot about memory, things that get occluded, things that you look back for inspiration from your time, things that, and it's the painterliness. I guess I'm taking pleasure in the painterliness and being able to explore how memory works. I'm in my mid-70s, so I think I'm really enjoying doing that. Plus, I also have a terrible memory now. This was called Shape-Shifting Blue, and this is called Storm Warning, which is part of a series on devastating landscapes, the devastation of landscapes that I started doing, not on purpose. They just kind of started to evolve as I read the paper on California fires. And that's it. That's it. I know that's long and I read it too fast or did it too fast, but I hope that you managed to hang in there. So Carlin, if you wanna...
I'm going to just suggest that everybody turn their cameras back on.
Yeah.
And I'm going to make myself the presenter, Lynn. And once we get all those cameras back on, then we all get to just give everybody a moment to do that. You can fill your screen with faces. And then we can all say, thank you, Lynne, very, very much. That was really terrific. Thank you.
Thank you, Lynn.
Yeah, well, you know, the thing is, once I got involved in this and it was too late to change my mind and do anything, I realized every one of so many on the screen had completely other and more experiences, and there's no way to do it in a kind of personal talk. So I kind of had to, I wanted to orient it back from the paintings that I was doing now. But it's so great to see Tanya Mars here, who was so instrumental in my life, and Susan and Rena. Like Gay Allison, talked me into doing so many things. I really would have stayed hidden under the bed without her. And of course, Lorraine. So it's so fabulous to see you here. And Abdi, who now knows way more about me than now we could have done this over wine, you know, later. So welcome and thank you all for hanging in. I'm totally happy for people to have comments, to chat, to talk about any aspect of the work. And you can also email me. Some of you have my email if you want to say, how could you not talk about your work at Fuse? Well, because I wasn't really at Fuse that long. I was just at Fuse long enough to boss around Joyce Mason for a bit before she took it over.
Taught me how to edit, and I'm still doing it.
I know. It's a dangerous thing when people teach you things.
I know.
And Carlin, I want to jump in about being at the dinner party or the Women's Culture Building.
Well, I just want to say that there are probably half a dozen or so women on this chat today who were a part of that Women's Cultural Building initiative way back when. And it started when Rena Fraticelli, hello Rena and David, it started way back then when Rena said, of course, I've got an idea, let me write a grant. You know, we want to put on Rena's tombstone, you know, grant, what was it, David, we were going to say, grant, Rena grant. In any event, she applied for a grant and got $15,000 to do a women's festival of art. And I think it took us about 16 or 17 years of doing art projects before we finally said, will we ever get rid of this money? We actually made money. It was bizarre. And it also changed the trajectory of about 30 women's artistic practices, including my own. When Lynn showed that cover of Now magazine, opening that gallery on Queen Street, I was the person wearing the shirt that said number 20. That was the first time I got involved opening a gallery, and it really did change the whole course of my life. So I think that $15,000, Rena, had more bang for the buck than any other $15,000 I've ever known about. So how many people here were part of the WCBC? Joyce, Tanya, Susan, that we all were flailing around and trying to get arrested.
Oh, Lorraine was part of it. In fact, it was Lorraine, it was Svetlana Zylan, the kind of a playwright, Russian playwright who knew Lorraine and had been doing a show in the old Toronto morgue, which had been given to a group of women who really weren't feminists to do women's art. And when the first show got censored because it was women's photographs of nude men, Svetlana, it got canceled by the board of women. Svetlana wanted us to take it over, but as everyone all came together, we realized it was going to be too big a project, and why not? I think it was Lisa Steele saying, why don't we use building as a verb as opposed to bricks and mortar? The Women's Cultural Building, Building Women's Culture, became an activist group of women as opposed to spending all our time trying to raise money to renovate the old Toronto morgue, which also felt a little on the creepy side, you know, to take over as a feminist project. Anyways, any comments? I know I didn't, I mean, there's so much was going on. Like Mitty is here. She was one of the experimental filmmakers at the Funnel, which I don't even talk about because I wasn't involved at the time, but, or comments about activities, Tanya?
Well, I thought it was great, Lynn, and I learned some things about your early childhood that I didn't know, even though I've known you for a million years. And I can't believe you've turned into a painter. You know, because I always think of you as like Rena and others, Joyce, builders. You know, I think we were lucky to be part of that 70s, 80s thing where we could just, because real estate was cheap, we could just do something. And we didn't need a lot of money to sustain our lives. So yeah, I was, you know, all of the political things you did, all of the things you started, but it was, they weren't individual, sorry, they weren't individual things, they were collaborative things. And I think a lot of us were really into, without even knowing it, making a community. We made Queen West, you know, we were part of, I mean, not exclusively, but, you know, that was, and that still lives on. That my students don't realize how lucky they are to already have those institutions in place. Anyway, it was great.
Yeah, I think because of my complete fury and realizing I had been conned for about, and like that women have been conned for about 2,000 years by to basically serve the needs and the priorities of patriarchy and male artists. It wasn't there. We had to make it. You and Elizabeth Chitty, Tanya, and Joyce and Susan, we were all like coming to that awareness, and some of us had to become part of changing things. And others, there were other artists, you know, there were Susie Lake, Barbara Assman, who perhaps were doing their practice in more commercial galleries and not part of that. But I think some of us felt compelled to do it. And in fact, I think it became my artist practice. I don't really want to separate it. Whether it was making Forbidden Love, that all of our feminist work and lesbian and gay politics fed into. So I think that that's true. I lost some notes because I lost a page of my notes, because I also wanted to say that what happened on the street in the 80s was when the Bamboo opened on the street. So it wasn't only the Cameron or the Spadina Hotel, but when the Bamboo opened and the reggae band started coming, and then more Black music fans started coming and Black artists started coming, because Toronto was such a segregated place. I mean, we met people through fireweed, but it was very segregated. And so it was also the very beginning of trying to address those issues. Tanya and Elizabeth Chitty did an action at the Artist Run Center conference about women. I remember reading about it.
I don't remember that. Gone.
No, you blanked it, but it was, you crashed the joint. So,
Lynn, I would also like to just acknowledge somebody else who's joined us for lunch today, and that's Eve Zarimba.
yes.
And Eve was the very first lesbian I was introduced to. And Peggy Atwood sent me over to see Eve because Peggy knew something I didn't about myself at the time. And hi, Audie and Eve. And Eve terrified me at the time, terrified me with her collection of hubcaps on her walls. But at the time, she was writing this incredible detective, you know, she was writing the lesbian character in fiction, and also making big steps towards visibility. So I just wanted to say hi, Eve, and acknowledge that you're here.
Say hi to me.
Hi.
Original T-shirt for the Parachute Club. My God, Rena, that's like archival.
What now? What next?
Lynn.
Lynn.
There we go. Well, you know, I really do want paintings. I'll tell you, the studio is part of my living space again. So if anybody or anyone in your networks knows of a place with a huge room for a studio, I was so jealous of Alice Tricard and a couple of the artists doing talks here that sort of showed their studio, which is the size of my whole loft. And I thought, how you can't do that in Toronto for sure. Like, how do you get that? Like, I'm so envious. So anything cheaper, because my loft is big, but it's too expensive for me to stay here for long. I've been looking at a place Zoe has, but I'm really not sure if it you know, we're like talking about what could be done with it. But I really want a studio now that I can make a mess like Fiona or Elise, you know, or just I do.
Now that the coronavirus has created the opportunity for people to rethink the wisdom of turning every other house into an Airbnb and the hollowing out of neighborhoods, as that's been shut down here in Prince Edward County, I expect there are going to be a lot of houses on the market, Lynn. So maybe you might just come here.
I know I hate to be an ambulance chaser, but there you go. Maybe one should just take advantage of having been ambulance chased out of neighborhoods once before.
Right.
And chase after this time. Any questions about any of the work, or anyone want to add to the not only like to the events that you feel should be a great thing to share?
I'm interested in the future.
Well, I'm hoping to one day be able to go out again.
Right.
And I don't know. You mean about my work in the future?
Yes.
Well, I want to continue.
All of our work in the future.
Yeah.
Because I think the future is very problematic.
I think so too. I mean, thank God I know through Hot Docs and some other places, a lot of younger artists and women who are doing, Abdi among them is doing fabulous work, taking on a Black gender and Black presence in galleries, but there's a lot of collectives of women also doing things which are really political. I'm not part of it because I'm old enough to be their great grandmother, but
Right.
I do feel good that they're there and raising trouble. And I think, you know, it would be actually great to do a series, maybe to do something like this that's not being recorded for publicity, where we all talk about women's cultural building or various cultural moments and kind of make an online oral history project. Rena, grants. But I because I didn't remember where it is. Like, you know, we were talking about the FemCab and other things I'd completely forgotten that I did, you know?
One does. Yeah.
Yeah. It's the dangers of oral history. And at some point.
Lynne,
What?
thank you for this. Thank you for this.
Oh, you're very welcome. I mean, I think I put it together quickly, so I know I rattled it off because of my timing.
No, I heard every word.
But I'm glad you had that you stayed with it.
Well, thank you very, very much, and thank you all for joining us.